Oh crap. Hey everyone, it's 7:06 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. July the 1st, 2022, years from some event, I'm assuming. I got a website. My brother sent me a website he had found on, it's the history. Chronology, this is part of it, Chronology of America's Freight Railroads. It's from the Association of American Railroads. Sounds very official. Well, actually, you know what? Before I go into that, this is important. Maybe two things. First off,
the old photo.
just so you know, and yeah, I'm doing this on the fly, so it's going to take a second. I'm sure my comment is buried. It didn't tell me about ashes. Anyways, just wanted to let you know that Ewar, because now it's Ewar, A-E-W-A-R, instead of Ewar Annan. Ewar thinks I'm lovely and poetic. I just wanted to show everybody that because knowing Ewar, he may change his mind about this on a dime without warning anyone. So anyways, there's that. The second thing is this. I know this is a lot to ask. It's not a lot, but you know, I'm being considerate. Just because I have an attitude about everything doesn't mean I'm inconsiderate. So here's the deal. Since about the beginning of 2019, I would say, maybe even before that, my subscriber count has increased from that time. We're talking about 3 years ago or so. Yeah. At least 1,000 from then to now. At least 1,000. But my counts, video counts, especially initial video counts, and even long-term video counts, have not increased. In fact, in many ways, have decreased. Now, I do look at all the metrics of, let's say, older videos, because I know there's a lot of people that'll come mostly just to hear the history, fiction, or science stuff. So I do look at those too, to see if that's where, you know, numbers are at, so that I'm not misinterpreting. Okay, so I look at all the metrics to see. That's not entirely where all the metrics are, by the way. So there actually are many in those last 3+ years that have actually come interested in other content. But yet, the videos, especially newer videos, are not only not reflecting that at least 1,000 increase in 3.5 maybe years, but they seem to be going down. So really, you know, not to endlessly harp on this, but it is important, because I'm hoping to try to figure out what methods a major platform like this is using to boost the apparent popularity of certain creators and topics and to suppress that of others. If you wouldn't mind, please, if you would take just a minute, and just on this video, you don't have to do them on all the videos or anything, okay? If you just take a second just on this video and go to the comments, just leave a comment. You can just leave the comment viewed, so that I know. I want to see how the numbers are reflecting the views in reality. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of people who won't comment, not because they don't feel like it or anything. And I know there's a lot of you that listen that do not interact. Oftentimes I interact with you outside of this format, so I know there are a lot of people they do not interact on this format. I am asking you just this once, if you will do that for me, so I can just get a better picture of what's going on. And there will be a number of people that are actually just monitoring me for other interests, and I know you won't comment either, so I understand that. But I appreciate it. Now, if your comment doesn't show up, if you would also please check again afterwards, make sure your comment showed up. If it doesn't show up, or if it gets eaten, again, I am asking you, please send me an email at John, Jon, at Obry Project, OBRYPROJEKT.info. That's the email address, or you can just go to the website. It's that Obry Project, remember with a K towards the end, .info. And there will be a contact link at the bottom of every one of the pages at the site. If you do that, I would greatly appreciate it. So thank you in advance. So yeah, my brother was looking at this railroad and train situation, because one thing that I just don't think that anyone out there who is looking into alt history is doing, not to my satisfaction or that I've seen, is really getting into the specifics of what would be required in building the infrastructure, we'll say the infrastructure as a whole. So everything that contributes to the infrastructure which currently holds up this nation and what it's able to do. And we're going to have to sort of forget about the fact that they have been consciously ruining this nation and its infrastructure for over half a century. So we need to look at it basically from its peak before they started actively ruining it. So about the 1950s is when a real push to collapse a lot of it happened, which is really strange that so many marvels would be so short-lived, and we'll actually see that in a lot of vital industries and infrastructures in the United States. And I know we see them in other countries. I'm not ignoring if you live in another country. I'm not deliberately ignoring those things because they are important. And I do think that even when they're happening in other countries, other Western countries, that they're meant to be producing a very similar result as what they're meant to be producing here in the United States or in North America, because it's been happening in Canada as well. It's not just specific to the United States. So everything that's been built up, that they claim to have been built up from the 1800s and forward, in my opinion, it's like the Ouroboros, right? It just is a picture, the snake eating its own tail. And the reason I bring that up is because in order to accomplish what they say that they accomplished in this very slim timeline, and keep something in mind, this timeline, exactly what we're looking at, we're going to see a similar timeline in almost every single major industrial infrastructure advancement, architectural, building construction advancement. We're going to see almost the same timeline basically repeated over and over and over again. Starting in the late 1700s, these developments, and most of it happening in the 1800s and the early 1900s, then all of a sudden cut off, and a beginning of a destruction of so much of it from that point forward in a lot of ways. The destruction really more of a people, but those things too. You have to understand a couple of things, and this is why we want to look broadly at so many things going on. The late 1700s is when the Prussian education reforms basically officially begin. And what they're doing is they are imposing these things on the commoners of Germany and the provinces that made up Germany, whether we're talking about Hanover or Saxony, Bavaria. Okay, they're the people known as Prussians are imposing these things on really the common people of the land. They're not imposing these on the lords of the land and all that, because they are the lords. And it is quickly spreading over into other Western countries that have a high concentration of a certain similar kind of people, tribally, a certain distinct tribal white people that are kept as a slave class. Now, what prompted these things, to me, so far, is a mystery. I'm sure that the people who did this, because these are the same people ruling today, that instituted the Prussian re-education, that instituted the orphan trains, that instituted the asylums, that instituted all of these brother wars. Not every white-on-white war is a brother war, but many of them in the last 2 centuries have specifically been engineered as brother wars, the same type of people fighting each other to take down our numbers significantly. These are all happening in conjunction in the same time period, the same basic years. Then we have some cloudy area before this, and this is when I think we're looking at a lot of the Israelites and Judahites being transferred from mostly Eastern Asia, India area, Yun or Inde, to Europe. And we see a lot of names that would allude to this very thing, that a lot of these countries weren't named before, which I think actually the reason that a lot of these countries were named that is to give us the sense, and they were named that during these educational reforms, it would seem, would be to give us the idea that these nations sprang up organically and of us, like of and by us, when nothing could be further from the truth. These aren't our nations. All of these nations are not presided over and run by the same people as the poor, common, working class people who essentially, we could say, built them, but I'll choose, if we're going from the late 1700s, to say repaired them, got them up and running. Now, maybe we didn't per se, but I think we did a lot. In fact, what I believe is that many people were left, even in America, and they were, as we would see in the Bible. So when a great king in the Bible would extract a lot of Israelites, a lot of Judahites from the area where we once lived, they would either, in some instances, they would leave Israelites or Judahites in certain places, really to maintain the land so it wouldn't be entirely overrun with either, we'll say wild beasts, for lack of a better term, because it's still problems with a lot of these words, but overrun with nature even. Overrun. And I would imagine they were able to maintain them to a degree. They would keep them from utterly failing and crumbling, these small, groups of people that they would keep there. They would also act, because it was rare that they would leave Israel and Judah to do this. It was more common they would bring in foreigners from other lands and other nations that they could control, especially people they could control. Or they would put their own people in there. And they would likely act their own people, when they brought them in, as regional, sub-regional, and local managers of lands, resources, and things like that. Though they would never be able to produce, in the kinds of amounts, if you brought a large population back in that were a people that were productive. But this was a common thing to do, even in the Bible. Check it out. They would leave sparse populations in areas that they cleared out to take, say, many slaves to another area that was more profitable to take them to, okay? And this is what I believe was done in America for some time, not as long as we might think, maybe a couple of centuries, maybe, and that some sorts of events or chains of events that are happening before the late 1700s over in Europe inspired the people who actually ruled over these countries to say to themselves, we really need the resources and industry available if we had the proper workforce in, I don't even know if they called it America or not, okay, here, what is now known as the United States and Canada. For some reason, I believe that they saw that they had a need for that, and at the same time, I think they had a need to get rid of a lot of us in Europe, perhaps. Maybe the stories that we hear about all of the barbarian, what they call, barbarian problems with especially the Gauls and the Germanic tribes happen much more recently than we think. The Spartacus type and scale rebellions, and why not? Why not? We are a stubborn, brutal people. Germanics and Gauls, Celts. So I imagine that they had very ample reason. Now, how they went about doing what they did, I'm sure I'm sure it will be understandable once we know what they did. But when I say understandable, I certainly don't mean reasonable or justifiable. Because I believe them doing things the way they did because they couldn't manage us, because they were somehow, I don't know, they were too weak. And I've used very harsh terms regarding these people in the past, and I'm not backing off on that, not a bit. You see, before they decided to do things this way, nations and men were men. A king led his army. He was racially the same as his army. Tribally the same as his army. Many kings in the Old Testament of the Bible died leading their armies in wars, in battles. Many nations that were even aggressive and antagonistic to Israel and Judah back in the land before we were removed, they even though they were antagonistic continually, for the most part with us, they still had an honor about them. They still had an honor, for the most part. I think specifically of stories of the Palestine or the Philistines gathering large armies to come to battle against Israel, and there was no Israel-Judah at that time. Israel. And Israel would gather their armies, and there would be the proposition made. And we can apply this to one of the most well-known incidents of this, David and Goliath. The proposition would be made, let us bring out our champion, and you can bring out your champion, and let them fight. And whoever wins will be the master, and whoever loses will be the servant. Now, this was intelligent, for one thing. It was intelligent because there was far less loss of life and resource if done this way. And it's more civilized. Now, I'm sure the reason that the Philistines would have suggested it because their champion was this Goliath. Likely not anything like Andre the Giant, where he had continual problems and pain with his giant stature. And him, if we can take the system translated as Bible measurements, the cubits and spans and all that to be correct, he would have been far larger than, say, a 7'7" guy like Andre the Giant. Okay. Once upon a time, people had honor, and they were men. And if a king was going to invade you because he wanted what you had, and that was typically he wanted something you had, they oftentimes, yes, they would carry away slaves, which, they would breed with, the women. They would use the men for various things. And things changed in the kingdoms and regimes as time went on. And just like in the vision of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, those kingdoms, they got stronger in the sense they got far and far more control, and they got far and far better at controlling people. But their quality, like in the vision or the dream, from gold to silver to copper to iron that had been blended as an alloy. And now, most people might know that in Daniel 2 and in Aramaic, it says iron and miry clay, which, think about that. That's, all that is an ore. We're either talking about an ore that hasn't been refined, so not nearly as strong as iron. That part actually is difficult to cope with, because they're supposed to get successively stronger, though far lower in quality. Iron and miry clay wouldn't be stronger. If it was an alloy, though, if it was actually iron mixed with carbon, that last empire with the 10 toes might be steel as opposed to iron. Steel far stronger, but not pure as iron, because it's an alloy. It's an alloy. It's not a pure metal like the other preceding four. So anyways, yeah, the regimes have gotten stronger, but the men running them haven't. They're not honorable, which is why I use such crude, demeaning sort of words on them. And if there's one thing I know about them and the way they act, they certainly do put on airs. They're very much, their behaviors are very much like your typical churchy churchgoer, in the sense that they are quite proper in the way they act. They tend to be raised understanding that the whole world is literally bound by all sorts of legalisms, and people are far more trained by them and their de-education systems to regard quote-unquote proper behavior with more value than honorable behavior. That's why, for one thing, if I have a description that is best communicated through what people would consider vulgar terminology, I'm going to use it, because I value honor and integrity far more than all of these superficial things that so many people seem to put at the forefront of their morality, when even their lifestyles themselves betray them as being degenerates. And I'm not talking about because they're doing things that they themselves might regard as degenerate behavior, masturbating endlessly, whatever it is that you want to fill in the blank with degeneracy, okay? That's not what I mean. I mean, they are degenerates in the fact that they don't even know the difference between honorable behavior, being good and decent, and simply a form of goodness and decency, which has nothing to do with honor and goodness. So we've got a regime that's been in power now for about 2.5 centuries, seems like. And they used all of these various techniques, the re-education, the moving around, lying to people, even lying to them about the foundations of America and the noble founding fathers and the noble Constitution, the noble Declaration of Independence, using various other types of races of people to often upset our communities because they have to keep up a lie, especially in the United States, but they have to keep up a lie with the common people because we are dispersed around in all of these various Western countries. They have to keep up a lie, a constitutional lie. Within the last century, all of the sitting monarchs that were sitting monarchs more than a century ago have, out of a sense of nobility and justice and fair play and democracy and equality and fraternity, the buzzwords, have abdicated because they just want to give the people freedom of democracy. You see, it's all a shit show lie. In all Western countries where we live, they have to keep up that shit show lie. And I really just think that no country on earth more exemplifies their bullshit than the United States, or the US and Canada, North America. I say North America. We can include Mexico too, but of course it's a different population, it's a different situation there. So mostly the United States, and plus I live in the United States. I don't live in Canada. I don't live in Mexico, so I can say the most about that. But I am talking about North America. The Americas, I think, are like the vanguard of their lying shit show. So, this is actually, as I said, a chronology of America's freight railroads. A chronology of America's freight railroads. And I won't actually be able to include everything that my brother was sending me. It's all very interesting, especially when they start talking about what they first used as tracks. Exotic hardwoods from Western Australia. That would have been a hell of a thing to ship. I mean, how much can you get on those small sailboats from back then and have them sail halfway around the world? I'll have to look into that closer because that's just insane. But let's look at some of these dates that they give us concerning the chronology of America's freight railroads and just really think on them a little bit to see if they can make sense in the real world. Now, this isn't what I'm going to be doing with my live stream. When I do the live streams, my plan is actually to provide with each propaganda piece that I show in them, providing a sort of a table that shows what certain factors should have been in place for all of this. Because everything you look at has to have a lot of factors that go into its conception, design, construction, maintaining, people factors and not just numbers. You can't just throw numbers at these things and say, oh, well, I mean, the railroad doesn't sound doable because of numbers, but we had tons and tons of undocumented workers. Well, okay, but what you're telling me is you had tons and tons and tons and tons of unskilled workers. You have to have a lot of skilled workers to do a lot of the work we're talking about. You can have a lot of labor. That's fine. But you also have to have a lot of skilled people to do things. And so we should be seeing proper proportions of labor and various tiers of skilled workers, including engineers, educated engineers or experienced educated engineers, architects, financing. Where's the financing coming from? There's so much to this. Materials needed. Where are the materials coming from? How are they getting there? So yeah, that would be for this. This is just, let's take a look at this chronology. So it states, 1797, the steam locomotive is invented in England. It's invented. Well, I think, for one thing, that word invented needs to be elaborated on. I'm sure someone has produced some sort of official elaboration. Some guy, I'm sorry that I don't know the name of the purported inventor. Perhaps he labored away at trying to figure out this design for the steam locomotive, and in that year he built his first prototype, or was that year the Eureka, where he came up with the concept? Well, I don't know, but if it is like the typical stories they try to tell us about inventions of these great, marvelous things that we have today, that they are disappearing at a record rate, I would imagine their official story is this guy was the poor son of a carpenter or a millwright or something, and he came up with this idea for the train, and then he managed to get investors interested in it and everything. Well, okay. So the thing about trains that I've found, if you invent a locomotive for traveling over rail, first off, so locomotives, trains, are they are the most efficient means of land travel if you don't want to count canals. And of course, canals are water travel, but they are, of course, dug over land in betwixt rivers, and so you can really traverse land via canals. So it's hard to say. I guess canals are almost the bridge between open water travel, as in large rivers, lakes, seas, and land travel. If we're talking about just pure land travel, trains are by far, way by far, about five times more efficient per ton of cargo shipped per mile, per gallon of fuel. And we're basing that now on diesel. Then, of course, the automobile car. Now, of course, you can apply this in different ways to different energies if you go back far enough. But look, if we're talking about coal and a steam engine, what we're looking at is basically rate of travel based essentially on things like friction. So you could apply that to coal in a steam engine. There's still plenty of steamboats out there. Steam power is in my opinion, far, far, far superior to gasoline, diesel. Okay, but if we're talking about just diesel, so we're taking a measure of energy and we're applying it to water travel, land travel. Water travel is by far the most efficient because you can move the most cargo over the greatest number of miles on 1 gallon of fuel, diesel fuel, by ship or boat. By ship, you can move somewhere in the neighborhood of 630 miles, 1 ton of cargo, 630 miles on 1 gallon of fuel, diesel fuel, by ship. Train, so we'll have to talk about diesels. You can move 1 ton of cargo about 550 miles on that same 1 gallon of diesel, 1 ton of cargo on land, trains. Now you go to your next, and the most popular today, unfortunately, and this should bring up a whole lot of questions, semi-truck. So that same 1 gallon of diesel is going to get a ton of cargo moved about 90 miles, something like that. So moving freight over land by train, super, super efficient. If you apply the same amount of energy, essentially, to those different forms of travel. And I would imagine that, in canal would probably rank somewhere between regular open water and rivers and train, but still probably more efficient, which is strange that they claim that the trains made the canals obsolete east of the Mississippi in a very short time, by the way. And I can't hardly believe that could even happen. But anyways, so here's the thing, though. The locomotive and the tracks, and we're not just talking about the track itself, we're talking about a train track that's just going over land is a system. It's an entire system. And that system needs to work at certain grades on certain kinds of lands with a lot of factors about the land that it's traveling over taken into account. You have to have very particular grades with train tracks because, for one thing, trains don't travel uphill or downhill very easily. They have trouble traveling up even a relatively slight incline because they slip. Why do they slip? Because they're designed to have a super, super minimum of friction, the actual wheels on the train to the tracks. Very, very, very small amount of friction. Now, this is part of the great beauty and ingenuity of train designs and how it can pull so much cargo over such a long distance and use such a small amount of fuel as compared to its far inferior later competitor. And it's hard to even believe that freight shipped by diesel and semis would even ever be a competitor to trains. That's about as inorganic as I can even see something being. It's a system. And for that system to function really well, a lot of factors have to be in place. Grades. You can't design a train to go into a sharp incline. It'll slip. It won't make it. You've all heard the little engine that could kid story. Excuse me. Same thing with declines, because if they simply put on their brakes, that doesn't mean they're going to stop. because there's such minimal friction between the wheel and the track, they might just slide. And if there wasn't a huge straightaway in front of that area where they might slide, there could be problems. Plus, they don't want to go too fast because they could lose control at too high a speeds. You have to really control inclines and declines with trains. You have to control curves. You don't want a wavy, crazy, curvy track. It's not going to contribute to the efficiency of a train. If you have to travel in a curve around things, you want to minimize that as much as possible, which means it is far more efficient if you have large hills or mountains to either grade them as slowly as possible. If you have to travel up an incline, you want to grade it as slowly as possible, and it's a very slight grade you need to be traveling on. Or, in many cases, of course, you would try to go around, you would go in valleys as much as possible, but then you still have to worry about how much grade and how much of a curve you really want to have so that the train can travel well, efficiently, not slip, not going up, not going down. There's a lot to it. There's a lot to it. So a lot of times you do have to blast through places. You do have to build bridges over places, which are not easy to do. You need skilled workers to do that. And to sell this kind of design, think about this, to sell this kind of design to potential investors at the time, you have to explain to them how this whole system is going to work. And you have to show them how it will work. And you're telling me that in 1797, this guy invents the steam locomotive in England, and in 26 short years, the first public railway in the world opens in England. So, did he not have to demonstrate to his potential investors how radically efficient the train would be in many situations, which also means developing the design that is part of the whole system of trains, which means the grading out of large, long areas, laying down a certain specific bed of ballast. So there are certain kinds of rocks and certain sizes, and they serve a certain particular purpose as far as cushioning the train, keeping the train, of course, dry, keeping it from sinking. And then you have the sleepers or rails, how they are designed, their size, the space in between them, their width, the width scale of the locomotive and the tracks, what the tracks are made of. These days, and for a long time, tracks have been designed from a certain particular kind of steel alloy, how they are attached to the sleepers or ties, and how all of that system works together. And I haven't even gone into the locomotive itself, but somehow the guy who invented it sells it to investors. What? How? Sight unseen? Did he just explain to them how this whole entire system was going to work to be the most efficient because of its lack of friction? The most efficient kind of land travel of cargo and people ever invented. And the first public railway in England 26 years later. Now, if that wasn't enough, only a few short years after that, it says on the timeline, 1827, the first railroad in North America, the Baltimore and Ohio, is chartered by Baltimore merchants, the Baltimore B&O Railroad. And I remember in Monopoly, I didn't know that it stood for Baltimore and Ohio. So when I would play Monopoly with my sister, we would just get if we got that property, we could just call it Body Odor Railroad, So it's chartered by Baltimore merchants in 1827. That is, I want to stress. I just want to stress that is a shitload of progress. if the locomotive if the locomotive was invented 30 years prior. That's a huge amount of progress. Like, unprecedented, unbelievable, because, again, okay, if they were able to build a railroad over a certain stretch in that time, remember all these factors. Are we saying this is like, I consider all of these things like the kingpin's bull. Okay, over and over and over again, this is like the kingpin's bull. Pow, all at once. We've got so much all at once. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, watch the movie Kingpin and the bull. Or the cow you thought was a cow. But, yeah, so no trial and error. No long-term thought out ideas about how they're all of a sudden, this guy has the most brilliant and efficient mode of transporting just absolutely gigantic sums of cargo over land. Kerpow. There it is. And then you don't think it would take development to figure out how best to engineer the curves? Well, we've got to do some trial and error because we've got to figure out what kind of inclines, declines, and curves this thing can take. Nope. 30 years. It's chartered by Baltimore. The Body Odor Railroad is being chartered by Baltimore merchants. 30 years. That's fast. That's fast, man. For easily the most brilliant invented way of carrying cargo over land. Pow. There it is. Okay, so we've got the Kingpin Bull in 30 years being chartered by Baltimore merchants, i.e. the Body Odor Railroad. So, only 3 years later, the first regularly scheduled steam-powered rail passenger service in the U.S. begins operation in South Carolina utilizing the U.S.-built locomotive, the best friend of Charleston. Now, I'm not even going to begin to unpack all of that. However, if we go with the official story, the amounts of the populations, even in Western states, and the form of community life was such that I would think that if you got a number of merchants to finance this venture, passenger rail is going to be an afterthought. Maybe a sitting car. Okay? Them saying passenger service, are we saying in addition to cargo? Because their absolute first main concern, of course, would be cargo. Cargo. The thing with industry, any industry, go back as far as you want. Industry and the growth of industry relies heavily on acquiring materials from distant places. It's exactly the way it was. It's exactly the way it is. You want to make steel? You're going to need taconite from Minnesota or Wisconsin. You're going to need limestone from Michigan or Ohio, or you might need dolomite also from parts of Michigan and other places, not all along the lakes. They might have to come in on rivers or so-called rivers. you need coal from different locations. Many of them, the biggest coal mines, of course, for the longest time, were on the East Coast, in the mountains. You need to bring all of that stuff together to make your steel. Industry relies on materials acquired from various places, or you're limited. Merchants are going to think first and foremost about transporting materials. And I really would just think that the passengers and what they might make off passengers is going to be afterthought. So when we get up to something like 1831, U.S. mail is carried on the rails for the first time. I guess they could say this was in short bursts. But when you get to the point of, let's say, let's look at, by 1838, I am going to skip a few of these. It says 1833, so this is 6 years after they say that the first railroad in North America was chartered by merchants in Baltimore. 6 years after that, it says approximately 380 miles of railroads are in operation in the United States. Now let's go back to point one, the engineering of the railroad itself. Not only grading it out, surveying for proper placement. This has to be in the right place, grading it out. It has to span rivers. It has to span gorges, gullies. You can't have it going down and up. It has to span all of these things. Oftentimes, if you can, you're going to cut through hills. If you can, you're going to blast through rock and mountain. And we're talking about the East Coast. The Appalachians are not that far west from where all of this is. I mean, really. Baltimore? Well, Baltimore isn't flat and even. My goodness, I'll clear this out. We'll say from Baltimore. It doesn't matter what direction you're going in. You would have serious topography to overcome from Baltimore. Which means you have to cut, you have to blast, you have to build spans over things. Railroads are brilliant, but at the same time, railroads are highly demanding. So then we get into the point where by 1838, so we're looking at 11 years after the first railroad in North America, the Baltimore and Ohio, chartered by Baltimore merchants in 1827. 1838, 5 of the 6 New England states have rail service, as do such frontier states as Kentucky and Indiana. Just to get to the closest points in Kentucky and Indiana from Baltimore. Not only we got Baltimore here, right? So you want to get into Kentucky and you want to get into Indiana from Baltimore. You are either going many thousands of miles over topography. You have to cut, you have to blast, or you have to build bridges. The Ohio River is an enormous river. You're going to have to build a bridge over that. Unless you go north and then you build a second track south. And that's not getting you out of the woods per se. That's not getting you out of the woods per se. Because you also have, if you're going to travel over West Virginia, you have extreme topography to get to Kentucky. One way or another, you're building more than I think that I can really express positively in a short amount of time. And then they say by 1840, 13 years after the first chartering by Baltimore merchants, more than 2,800 miles of railroad are in operation in the United States. They would have to have everything I just said as far as accoutrements go. You have to transport all of those materials to all of the points, the vanguards of every single rail you're building. That includes all of those materials to build bridges. That includes all of those materials to blast, to move everything that you've blasted. And how far along are we with other forms of steam-driven machinery by that point in time? Because you damn well better have a lot of other steam-driven machinery just to move a lot of the stuff that you need to move. You better have steam-driven cranes. You better have rail yards, points of connection to get cargo, to drop cargo. Not just little stations in places as you go. Stations are for people. Rail yards, because these merchants are going to be economically minded and they're going to be thinking about moving around resources from one place to another. If we're to accept the establishment's version of chronology, I say by the time we even get to 1840, which is when we're supposed to be starting to experience more of a steel boom by 1840, you don't have fucking close to the amount of track that you would need laid. I don't give a shit if you want to throw 5 million Chinamen at it. There's so much more to building and implementing a railroad than millions of Chinamen can explain. One of the issues, of course, that I have with all of these popularized alt history people out there is their total failure in talking about the minutia of logistics, the minutia of the talent required on point in all of these particular places, the minutia of the problems that every single work site had to overcome in the time frames we're talking about. And for somebody to come trotting along and say, oh no, this is all totally doable. Fuck you. Because you're not addressing these mountainous problems. And railroads is just one of them. It's just one. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. And how so many people could get popular organically, who for the most part, they're just skimming. All of it's just surface level skimming. And they're not taking the time to accumulate and digest and then distill for their viewers the raw data to try to show us the possibility or impossibility of these things happening. If they could possibly get as popular as they appear to be by doing what they do, it tells me that either, for the most part, people are very dumb. They can't think. And I'm not going to blame that entirely on most people out there. Because as I just mentioned earlier in this video, we have this very deliberate, very aggressive re-education system in place. These days, they just call it public school. That's all it is. That's exactly what it is. That is its function, to teach your children not to think. So I don't entirely blame people if that was it. But I don't think that's entirely it. I think a lot of it is a promotion of a lot of these people very inorganically. I think it's really a lot of various parts contributing to a whole that would make a lot of people who are not doing their job in trying to bring a lot of very vital points and bits of information to you. And unfortunately, it's a lot of us that don't do our own work and our own due diligence to try to think these things out to see if they're possible or not, based on all of the available official data. So with that, I will one more time ask you very politely, if you would, just take a second and let me know in the comments that whoever you are, that you viewed this, and then check after you submit to make sure that it actually came through and it's on the video. And if it doesn't show up, please send me an email, which you can get the email address through the site, Obry Project, projekt.info. That's the site. Okay, so with that, I'll wrap it up and see you next time.